Hi everyone, this is Anshul and you are watching to the June15 podcast, and today we have with us Jake Charen. He is a risk architect at Lakeside Insurance. He is a cyber risk specialist. He is well known in the accounting circles as the fractional risk leader you want for your firm. He specializes in working with small businesses to help them reduce risk and increase their profitability. Jake, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Anshul. I really appreciate you inviting me on today, and I'm excited to discuss a lot of different topics around this whole accounting firm world and how much it's been changing within the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years.
Oh, absolutely. Let's start with your background. Like, tell me more about your background and how did you get into being like a risk architect?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I started in what's called wholesale insurance. So the wholesale insurance market is different than where I am now, which is technically called retail insurance. So the quick background is retail insurance is where I go directly to consumers to actually help small business owners with their insurance program, risk management services, and really anything that we can to be that outsourced risk manager, as you said. And we'll kind of dive into that later. So the wholesale insurance brokerage world, what they do is when me as a retail agent, when I need to access specialty markets, maybe because a client has had many claims in the past, or depending on the services that they provide to clients, then you need to go to the wholesale broker because they have access to a whole different plethora of insurance markets. So in the US, in London, wherever globally as well, to help place different types of insurance programs and risks. And so I started in the wholesale world and then made my move out to Colorado. And from that is where I became in this retail space because I really wanted to help business owners. I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, and being able to be in this world has helped me to become an entrepreneur because I can actually help business owners with different risk management plans. And we'll kind of, like I said, go into what that exactly means specifically for CPAs later.
So let's dive in. Like, I want to learn more about what a risk architect does. Like, if you can share a few examples of how you work with CPA firms.
Yeah, that absolutely. So you're probably wondering, how does insurance and architect have anything to do with one another? Because they don't. So except for when I'm helping an architecture firm. But what we created that name for here at Lakeside is because we actually help design plans similar to an architect, but we're designing an insurance plan or a program to help you as a business owner with different risk management solutions that then allow you to lower your risk in certain areas. So, specifically with the CPA world, I work with insurance markets that offer different risk management services, such as online webinars that offer continuing education courses. So, as you're renewing your license every year, rather than having to pay different money out of pocket, it's actually included within in your insurance premium. This then can bring your insurance cost down because you're actually taking your time to do these different classes, learning different protocols and how you should or shouldn't be doing work as a CPA. And then you're also gaining continuing education courses without having to pay it out of pocket. And when your firm gets big, 5, 10, 50, 100 CPAs on staff, those costs can add up. So being able to have that as a part of the insurance policy can save a lot of money, while obviously putting people in a better place. Another
Okay.
way that we help firms is providing them different sample engagement letters. So as they're going out and engaging with their different clients, it's what type of engagement letter are you using, and how do you know that that engagement letter is actually helping you as the CPA protect yourself liably? And then third, probably the hot topic that we're going to touch on later are those WISPs, the written information security plans. That's now a requirement in the CPA world. You need to have those put in place. And so we don't technically write a WISP for you, but we're happy to connect you with a partner that can do that. But we can review it. We can help pair that with a cyber insurance policy, because a part of a WISP is similar to an incident response plan. What happens if you have a breach? Where do you go? And does everyone on your staff know how to handle these things? And so being upfront and honest, and the term that I always use is being proactive rather than reactive. Let's try to figure out what the problem is ahead of time, whether it's sitting down at a table and having those conversations openly rather than waiting for crisis to happen and now we need to act, because no one acts their best within crisis unless you've put a plan together in place.
So, what kind of claims do you usually see? So you mentioned one cyber breach. I'm assuming that's a big one. Like what other kinds of claims do you see?
Yeah, so with cyber breaches, I mean, we could probably have a whole nother podcast conversation about the different cyber breaches that go on, right? Especially with a CPA firm. So invoice manipulations, fraudulent transfers of funds, ransomware demands. Those are just the three hot topics that I'm seeing. But it's also breaches of personally identifiable information. And so that's all on the cyber side of the house. But then when you're looking at it from the CPA side too, when you're looking at it from their side, it's those errors and omissions liabilities too. So, did you cause an error or omission in a service that you're providing? And typically, those don't get found for multiple years until someone's going back and looking at their books. Maybe they're looking at their financial reporting, depending on what service you provide. So, looking at your policy and making sure that you have a retroactive date that's covering you from the time that you started your business can protect you for our 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I just helped a firm whose retroactive date was in the 90s. So we're talking a lot of coverage that's going back because you never know what an issue may arise until maybe a business you've been helping for 20 years sells. Now they're looking at their books and they realize that you were the one helping and there was an issue. So we want to make sure that you're going to have the right coverages. So if we want to dive in a little bit on the coverages for the errors and omission, it's looking at what type of deductible do you have? Do you have first dollar defense is something I'm always talking about. So making sure that that insurance is going to come in right at the claim incident before having to truly pay out on a deductible amount because some deductibles may be pretty high. Also, having defense costs that are outside the limit of liability. And I'll say that again, having claim expenses or defense costs outside your limit of liability. So we don't want those attorney costs to erode your limit of liability that you may need to utilize to pay out excessive amounts of an insurance claim. Because as you know, as well as I, attorney costs can add up, especially when we're
Yep.
really diving into the weeds and going through accounting books and bookkeeping and things like that.
I would think that accounting firms need these kinds of insurance more and more. So that's a good segue into the next thing I want to talk about, right? Talent shortages. That's
Yes.
all everyone's talking about in the accounting firm space. How is that increasing or changing the risk profile of most accounting firms?
That's a great question. So now that there's obviously a shortage of labor, we're having to hire in different ways than we ever did before. It's no longer Anshul and Jake are going to the office every single day. You might be in New York, I might be in California, and maybe that's a benefit for firms because you have someone working the East Coast hours, you have someone working the West Coast hours, and so you're able to work longer periods of time, especially during those hard tax seasons. So that can bring different cybersecurity risks because people are working on different networks. That can bring different errors and omission risks because people are not working as diligently as they may be if they're surrounded by their peers. And then, third, one that I've actually been finding now that people have employees all over the country is do you have the proper workers' compensation coverage in place? So, workers' compensation is a requirement per states. There's a few states that are monopolistic and you do not need to carry workers' compensation there. But typically in most of the United States, it is a requirement. And so making sure that you have your employees in each and every state listed on that policy is so crucial. So we'll go through these policies sometimes, and there may be 3, 4, 5 states missing. And what that means is if your employee were to get injured while working, because that's what workers' compensation coverage is intended to cover, and you didn't have coverage for them, not only are you going to be paying that injury out of pocket potentially, but now the Department of Labor within that state and the workers' compensation division can actually fine you penalties for the number of days, months, and years that you didn't have that coverage in place. So Lakeside's located in Colorado. I believe they just increased the cost, but I think it's roughly around $500 per day if you don't carry workers' compensation. So if you
Yikes.
multiply that out by 365 days, and then however many days or years you haven't had coverage, they're going to backdate and they're going to charge you for that entire amount. So that might not be a coverage that people are really thinking about because it's not these emerging risks and workers' compensation is this old coverage, but it is something that I see is just so important.
I mean, as a business owner, I was thinking when you were talking that there's just so many permutation combinations of how an employee could work for me.
Right.
that there's no chance in hell that I would be able to keep a
Absolutely. Well,
keep a
that's
track of everything, right? And you talked about like work from home, but then there's unlimited PTO. So I was like, is that going to change my risk? Like,
right. And
I
and
mean,
you're
I don't
right.
know.
I think that's perfect. And so we always say it's not impossible to be in compliance, but it's improbable because you have to rely on so many different people and so many different things to make sure that your business is in control. And so you brought up an awesome point on Shul about, hey, I want unlimited PTO. I need to be able to work from home. I want all these demands. And so that brings us into the topic of employment practices liability coverage, or in insurance, some people call it EPL or EPLI. And so, what employment practice liability is going to cover the business owner from is a couple different things. So, we'll start with what's called first party coverage. The first party coverage is going to cover anything that happens between employees or between an employee and an owner. So, whether that may be any sort of wrongful terminations, or Anshul didn't hire me because of my age or my race or my ethnicity or my gender, or maybe it was a wage and hour violation or some type of workplace violence. And so the first party is what happens inside the walls. Now, the third party coverage is so important because what if Anshul is treating his clients terribly and he's been treating them horribly for years because they're too old and they don't understand him, or they're a certain gender and he gets doesn't get along as well with males or females or whatever it may be. Now somebody wants to litigate against you, and we're seeing this happen all over the United States. California was one of the leading states that I'm seeing this because they have such broad laws for employers to get sued. So here in Colorado, actually last year, they broadened what the definition of sexual harassment is, making it easier for employees to sue employers. And now there's attorneys that are most likely going to take advantage of this to reach out to employees and say, have XYZ thing happened to you? Well, yeah, that's happened to me. I was treated like poorly, or someone was rude to me, or they didn't hire me internally and they went externally, even though they said they prefer to hire internally. They're going to try to find anything they can to sue an employer. So that employment practices liability coverage has just evolved, it's grown. And like you said, with people working from home, is it a wage and hour violation? I worked overtime. I deserve more pay, but because I'm working from home, did I really work overtime? Did I not? How can we track these things? Because we're not all in front of one another anymore.
Yep. So, as I'm thinking about what I do, right, I help accounting firms build global teams, and that increases or well, that increases the risk profile, right? So, a lot of firms right now in the accounting space, they're looking to countries like India. They're building teams there either through working with an outsourcing vendor or, using direct ownership, setting up their own thing. What does that mean for like as an accounting firm owner? What are some things I should keep in mind if I'm looking to do that? Like how does that change like my risk, my insurance? Like tell me more about that.
I would definitely say it's going to bring up a lot of information about your processes and procedures. So, how are you being diligent with your employees? Everyone's being trained the same way. And this kind of leads into another coverage I wanted to discuss, which is called crime coverage. So, it's not external crime, somebody coming in and breaking into our business, but it's internal crime, especially with CPAs, with bookkeepers. Very smart people that work inside of books. They're trusted, you're given information, you're given access to bank accounts, whether it be your clients or your own. And so, could you cook a book and maybe steal money, maybe $1,500 a month? Might not sound like a lot, but as we add that up over 10, 15, 20 years, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars that somebody may be stealing from you. So, having crime coverage, in addition to making sure that your controls are in place and processes and procedures, I feel is just so important as we continue to expand. And I think that it's an amazing thing what's happened since COVID, that we're all able and allowed to work in different places, and it allows owners to stretch who they could have employed for them before. It's stretching that talent pool and it's making them stronger. But as we're growing, we have to grow in a smart and concise way and make sure that everything's in control.
I agree. I mean, when I think about taking a client to India, like one of the first things we talk about is risk, right? like what exposure, like how your exposure to risk goes up, like not just in the
Right.
US but in India, right? How do you make sure people don't, breach their contracts or their employment contracts? So all of those things. But one thing that comes up a lot is cyber risk, data security. So like what tips do like how would you tell like an accounting firm owner like about cyber risk? Like what are some things you should do? Especially like they're opening an office in India. It's thousands of miles away. Um, so tell me more about that.
Yeah, so and I'd like to question you a little bit too, because I know you have such great experience in that. So I mean, I would do similar to things that we're going to be doing here in the States, but then obviously making a bit more controlling there because we need to make sure, okay, if they're in India, are they coming into the office? Are we making sure that they're at a secure workspace? So their computers are secure, they have multi-factor authentication, they have backups similar to their office in the US. And I would like to hope that those are setups that you're putting in place for those kind of satellite offices, if you will. Right. But I think that it's so powerful, this idea and the way that you're doing these things, because as the people and employees are working in India, we're asleep here in the States. And then when we wake up and they go to bed, we're doing work and they're sleeping. And then we just kind of have this almost like a seesaw effect of going back and forth where you're so much more efficient than you ever have been before. So, from a cybersecurity standpoint, I would definitely say partnering with the right IT firms and cyber and managed service providers is going to be important. Not everyone's going to have the expertise, and you have to vet that out. Similar you would as a doctor, you're not just going to go get one opinion. You need to go get many opinions to make sure, okay, this is the right fit for my business. And when you're helping these businesses grow and get this office in India, what are some of the things that you're discussing with them on Shul from that cybersecurity standpoint, in addition to kind of the things that I mentioned, right? Because as I'm diving into this world and this journey with you, it interests me so much to see, okay, what should or shouldn't we be doing?
I mean, so the first thing we talk about is the fear is more the risk is cybersecurity, but the fear is the fear of unknown. Right?
Right.
There's cybersecurity risks here in the US too. But what scares us about India is we don't know India, right? So I mean not me, but most
Right.
accounting
You know,
firm owners,
India.
yeah, most accounting firm owners, right? They've not traveled to Asia or India. So they just don't know. They know if something went wrong here, they could call you. But like what
Right.
happens if something like this happens in India? So that is the first fear or challenge I address for them, that, hey, I get that part, right? And then there's a lot of things that we did for our last client who wanted to set up an office in India. So the first thing is the office, like everybody comes into the office. Work from home in India is only on like an as needed basis, only for emergencies, especially for the first few years. Because
Right.
like if Jake, you're going to India, right? The first 2 3 years, you want to play it safe, right? Then you can think about innovating, being creative, but for the first few years, play it safe, have an in-person team, and the office has restricted entry. Like everybody, like you need biometrics to enter the office. So that right there, you
Okay.
can't
I
bring
like
in friends. Yeah, I mean you can't really just bring in friends. You Nobody who's not authorized to enter the office can enter the office. There's a log who comes into the office, who leaves. These logs can only be accessed from the US offices. No one in India can access these logs. That's
Wow.
one thing, right? The other, you have cameras. Like you have cameras everywhere in the office. And like these things are pretty normal in India. So it's not like we're setting up something that's like out of the
Right.
picture in India, right? It's pretty normal. Um, so then we have like cameras, security cameras. Again, like only people in the US can see those feeds. They're the only ones who have access to them. So no one in India can like delete it or edit it. None of that stuff is going to happen. Computers, right? We don't have printers in the office. No one can print anything. So it does make things a slightly inconvenient because sometimes there are things you need to print, but it's still like the benefits outweigh the negatives of not having
Right.
printers, right? um, there's no data stored in India. So what I do is like this is direct ownership, right? So if you were to go to India, you'll own everything, the people, the team, the infrastructure. So the data never leaves your servers, right? It never goes to India. It's always in the US. All the computers that are in India, they're just shell laptops. And all you can do is use a VPN, log into the servers here, and do your work. So that gives a big sense of security and like it's just a big sense of peace to American firm holders, firm owners that all right, I have my data. It's not going to a third party. And the clients of CPA firms, they're happier too because they trust you, right? They don't
Absolutely.
necessarily trust an outsourcing company. But when they know that this is your setup in India, they're like, all right, then I'm fine. So there's a lot of these things we do, right? Of course, multi-factor authentication, everything, biometric entry, shell computers, and then you talked about managed service providers like IT companies. So we have like we as in me, I've done a big audit of like good MSPs in
Okay.
like cities in India. So if you go to India, like anyone that you'd be working with has already been vetted by me, and they've already worked for other American companies that have spoken to and that have made sure that they are happy. So these are some things we do. Um, Nothing is ever foolproof, but
Of course.
put all these things in place, like your risk goes down by like a lot. Like you replicate what your risk is here in the US in India, right? To a realistic extent possible. Does
Right.
that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's so powerful. And as you were speaking about the Shell laptops, all I was thinking about is a VPN, right? And it makes so much sense. You're remoting into computers or data centers here in the US and it's protected and you know that it's vetted. And I mean, I think it's so powerful what you're doing and the way that we're all changing, the way that businesses are able to operate now. I don't see a reason as a CPA firm, if you're looking to grow and you're frustrated with what your current setup is, why not adventure into this world? I mean, all we hear is from January until the end of March and pretty much beginning of April, CPAs just go into hibernation. They
Yeah.
work 60, 70 hours a week. They're not happy. They're frustrated. They're doing all these things. And why not utilize different resources to allow yourself to have work life balance or work life integration, to want to do what you want to do and not have to say that a quarter of every year is just shut down. Because I mean, a quarter of every year times four, that's a full year. So if you're
Yep.
working for 40 years, that's 10 years of your life that you're saying, you know what, I'm just going to be too busy and I'm not going to be able to deal with things. Where don't you want to spend time with your family? You want to spend time doing these things and kind of getting off the whole risk topic, right? It's just, what do you want to do? And I think that as you're evolving this powerful product and it's becoming more attractive to be a CPA again, because I think that in generations that are getting younger and coming out of college, it's not really the most attractive business that they want to go into
Yep.
because of those months. But if you're finding out a way like you have to streamline this process, to allow yourself to grow and to be in a better and smarter position, I think it makes all the sense in the world.
So I'll share a statistic with you that you'll like. Before COVID, I think only about 6 or 8 US CPA firms had their offices in India. So these were like your big four and maybe like RSM, BDO, just like the big ones.
Okay.
Now 50 US accounting firms have opened their own offices. Like this is not outsourcing, their own offices. Every year I see 4 to 5 firms, and the size of the firm that's going to India is getting smaller. Like it started with the big four, but the last
Right.
one that opened an office in India, they were 13 million in revenue.
Okay.
So it's going down, and my goal is to take it down to 3 million, right? But not quite there yet. But I think in a year or so, firms who can have a small team of 5 in India, they'd be able to thrive in India too. And
Absolutely.
that's just so I
I
want
think
to
it's
talk to
I think
you.
it's
Sorry,
exciting
go ahead.
though, and not to interrupt it because I want to hear your question, but I think it's so exciting, especially for as businesses are getting out of or owners are getting out because they're in their late 50s, 60s, and they're done running the business and they're selling now. This might be more opportunity for those people that are acquiring these firms to say, okay, I didn't have the employees here in the US that I could do this with, but if Anshul is saying that I can outsource this and I don't even have to be the biggest and the best firm, why would you not?
So that's a very interesting thing you said, like buyers and sellers, right? So I'm now getting approached by like search funds, like they're just smaller individual people who've raised money. They want to buy 3 or 4 accounting firms, and one of the first things they want to do to create value is to open their own office in India.
Okay.
So that's creating value. Sellers, right? As I'm talking to people, if you have your own direct ownership firm office in India, that increases your multiples. So if people are looking to sell, like that's also a big value creation lever.
Right.
Um, so you're right. This is happening, and I love it. It's super exciting for me as well. There is one thing, like when people, like in today's world, geopolitical risks, they are just, I mean, they're everywhere.
Right.
That's one question I get asked a lot. Like, how do we handle geopolitical risks when we're opening an offshore office? And especially if it's direct ownership, then there is no vendor that I can just fire, right? This would be me. So I have an answer, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
So, talking about the hiring and firing process of an employee that would be working for you, but in India, was that kind of the question?
More about geopolitical risks, as in, like, what if India and US, their relationships go sour, right? So what if, I
Yeah, so
mean,
I get that, and I think I'll knock on wood because we've had a great relationship between the two countries, and we hope to continue that, especially because of the growth that India has and the United States as well. It's both two countries with very smart, well-educated people that are hungry to work and want a similar dream, I believe. So if geopolitical risks do come up, then again, it's discussing, okay, what does our risk program look like? What do our insurance policies look like? Did we set up a global policy? And I know that you and I, Anshul, have been working and are going to continue to work on creating a different insurance product specifically designed for these firms that are here in the US as well as in India, because now we're talking about the risk between the business, but also geopolitical. You're right. So for me, unfortunately, I don't think I have an exact answer. I think you kind of stumped me there because it is an interesting topic. And I know that we've discussed this with different manufacturing firms here in the States that outsource their manufacturing to Taiwan. What would happen if China invades Taiwan and now I'm not able to get my widgets or I'm not able to get my parts? And what happens if that's our sole source of manufacturing? So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are from more of an intangible asset piece within CPA firms, because it's not, hey, we're sending you our widgets or whatever that may be. It's something that's going on with more data processing online.
so there's a couple of things, right? First, as you mentioned, India and US have really good relationship, right? I think in terms, like, they're both democracies, they're both, like, the population of both countries have a similar goal, right? As India is moving more and more towards like a free market, US style economy, it's just happening. One of my podcast guests said something very amazing. He was like, the energy that you see in India right now is the energy you saw in the States after World War II. Everyone's hungry, everyone wants to succeed. So, with that in mind, right, it's very unlikely that the two countries go head on.
Right,
Like, even things like, even with the Russia Ukraine war, right, India and US were not on the same page, but there was no deterioration of relationship.
right,
So even if something like that could test the relationship, I don't think we have to worry much about it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for it. And one of the things that we did with our last client was, they had direct ownership, but instead of registering their own entity, they used my company in India to be their employer of
mm,
record. So what that does is it shields them from any geopolitical. Let's Worst case, right? Let's say there are sanctions on American companies, right? They're not impacted by that at all because I am their employer of record in India, right?
okay,
So that's the local Indian company. So that's one thing. Let's say things go really bad and both countries start to hate each other, then you still have direct ownership, but then you can let the employer of record go. They're like, all right, I don't think this is working for. I don't think the prime minister or the president want this to work. So then it's a simple sign off that say, okay, we're closing down our India office. That's the worst case scenario. But again, you have direct ownership, but you don't have legal liability if you use an employer of record. So that's one thing we did with our last client, and the idea was we did it for 2 years, and actually just last week we registered their entity. So it was, once they're comfortable that, okay, I think we understand India, I think we believe you when you say that geopolitical risks are really low, now we can go and register our own entity. So that's the beauty of direct ownership, right? You start slow and you scale it up as per
right,
your comfort, right? There are some companies that I know who are like, we don't want to register our entity ever, we just want to use an employer of record. So, and that's fine, it doesn't cost a whole lot. So those are some ways you can address geopolitical risks. And when people travel to India, right, I took my clients to India, when they see that the culture, the professional culture is so similar, it's just people there look different, talk different, eat different, but in the end of it, like, we're all
Yeah,
right?
we're all human, and they could say the same about us if they come to the United
Exactly.
States.
So that puts them at ease that, okay, I think a lot of our fears are overblown.
I like that. No, and I think that's a great model because it's you're stair stepping them up, similar to what we do with risk and looking at different limit options and different insurance policies. It's let's get you comfortable. Let's show you what you need to start, and then if you want to make a change once you get more comfortable, we can do that. So I'm excited to kind of continue working together and see where we can really grow this together on Shul. It's really been a great conversation.
Absolutely. So I do have two more questions. How are we doing on time? You
We're
still
yeah,
have.
we're good. We're good on time.
So, see, what I do, you know what I do? I do is direct ownership, right? I'm not an outsourcing company. I don't provide accounting services. All I do is take you, Jake. Hey, you can find people in the US. You want to do something in India? We'll set up an office you own. That's one model of building a team in India. The other is working with an outsourcing company where they either give you dedicated employees or they sell you hours that, okay, you can, you have 50 hours of work. In terms of risk, like how do you compare the two options? Like as somebody who's as a risk architect, when you look at these two options, like what are some pros and cons? Like tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of pros and cons between both. And I know, especially in insurance too, there's a lot of insurance agencies that are starting to look to outsource work to India, to the Philippines, and to these trusted vendors for outsourcing hours or actually hiring someone on to be an employee of your firm. And so I think that having someone that's working for another firm, like a payment employment firm, but then they actually come in or working for you, there's obviously risk there, but you're trusting that the company that you're working with has vetted this employee. They're working hard. You know that they're trusted and that they're interested and invested in actually becoming an employee and a part of your team. So I think that there's kind of some back and forth there, but having your own office, I think, like you said, is going to definitely bring certain risk because it's the trust factor. How do I trust that they're going to do the things that I want them to do? How do I know that they are who they say they are when I can't meet them in person, or even when we do a Zoom call, it's kind of tougher hours of the night or the morning for me or them, right? So I think from a risk perspective, it can really go either way, and I don't see one that's more or less risk than the other because at the end of the day, it's this trust factor. It's did you create the protocols and the procedures that you want? Because what you're going to put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And so if you're not willing to invest your own time to actually create these things and make sure that you're setting them up for success, how can you really get frustrated if they don't really understand everything? And I think that may be an issue here with our culture in the United States is that kind of throwing people into the mix and just thinking that they can do it because they've worked at a firm before where people need some rules and regulations of the road, and it's hard to get mad at someone when you didn't truly set them up for success.
So I think you brought up a good point. It's not quite on topic, but training, right? You said however much you put in, that's what you get out. One thing that I'm seeing is the way American firms, like the way we train people over here, is very different, right? We'll have an orientation, but for the most part, I feel like every job I had, I got thrown in the deep end of the pool, and
Right, you do.
then I
Sink or
figured it
swim.
out. Yeah, sink or swim, exactly. That's not how I feel things work in India. They need a little more instruction, um, written instructions, a little more help, and then they come out. So I think that's one struggle a lot of American firms have in India, where they do training, they're, but then when they don't see the results, they get frustrated. And I always tell them that you have to train people the way they want to be trained, the way they're used to being trained. So that was a good point.
Yeah,
I,
and it's an interesting concept, right? Inputs equal outputs. And so how frustrated can
oh,
you really get depending on what you do or don't do?
oh, absolutely. So then we've talked a lot about creating an insurance product for companies that are looking to establish an office in India, right? I'm just curious, like how would something like that look like? Because the way I think about risks, right, there's financial risk, right? In terms of cost, an accounting firm, depending on the size of the team they want to set up in India, it's 50,000 that they're spending, or they could go up to 500,000, right? Um, so that's the cost, right? Then there's geopolitics, then there's US compliance, 7216, there's cyber issues, potential lawsuits in India. Like, what could a policy look like? And I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts. I know you'll need a lot more information. We'll have to have a lot more discussions before we come up with something
Of
concrete.
course, but I think it's first determining where is our jurisdiction level. So if there is going to be a loss, depending on where the loss is, where's that jurisdiction? So if they're suing the firm, I mean, is it where the firm's located? Would the firm technically look to sue the employee because of the issue if it was a problem that somebody in India, one of their employees did? But I guess again, it depends on the structure, like you said. Are they rolled up under a different entity and they're technically working for you? Or is it really your own office that you've now built in India and you have them working for you? So I would definitely say those similar insurance products that we've already been discussing, but probably putting some sort of foreign liability or foreign risk in it. But with CPA firms, rather than like manufacturing or things like that, it's different because it's an intangible asset. It's a financial piece. It's a
Mhm.
cybersecurity issue that we're worried about rather than, okay, we're actually worried about something happening with a physical asset. And so what I think takes so much risk off the table is the fact that these employees in India are VPNing into a data center in the United States. So, what is the possibility that there would be any sort of breach from a hacker that's requesting something within India or within China that's not coming back to the United States? Because I think what you get into is how are we going to pay it out? And I'm thinking specifically ransomware demands, right? If it's the Indian dollar versus the US dollar, now we're converting it into euros, we're converting it into whatever they may be requesting. It's like, okay, well, what does that look like? But I think that VPN aspect of it, rather than them working directly off of their own computers, is going to take so much risk off the table. So it's an interesting aspect. But again, it's training employees the right way. It's making sure you have employee handbooks for your employees to know what they should and shouldn't say, right? Because now we're talking about cultural differences. What we might say to one another here in the United States may be completely different than what two people say to someone in India. But like we talked about at the end of the day, we're all human and we all want to be treated equally. We want to follow the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated, and making sure that those things are aligned. And so I think it's exciting. I definitely think there is risk, but if you're not taking a risk, then are you really going to end up growing at the end of the day?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel I feel that's one thing accounting firm owners need to do better is to take educated, calculated risks more.
Right.
And I mean that the purpose of this discussion was not to scare accounting firm owners. It was just like, hey, there are these risks, but then there are easier ways. There's an easy or simple way to address these risks as well.
Absolutely.
So Jake, my last question to you: is there anything that you're passionate about that you'd like to discuss today that I didn't ask you? Um,
No, I think that we hit on all the topics. And I think that that last point that you said is taking calculated risks. And maybe it's reaching out to Anshul and figuring out, okay, are you able to share a CPA firm with me that you've helped do this before? Because I think that when you hear a friend or a partner or someone that you may not know that has done something and succeeded, that's when it's that viral effect, right? We're all scared to do things that no one else has ever done, but we need someone to be that pioneer. We need someone to grow and to do these different things and to really take risks educatedly to do things the right way. So I think it's again we're in a really awesome space. It's very interesting. I think the timing could not be better with the emergence of technology, working remote, the acceptance of working remote, that is specifically,
yeah,
because it's always been a possibility. It just wasn't always accepted here in the US and nationally. And then third, it's really that mergers and acquisition that we're going to be seeing within the next 5 to 15 years. So I heard on a business podcast recently that like baby boomers in the United States that are owning all this wealth in the country, like 90 to 95% of their actual wealth is in their business and not actually in their
oh,
pockets right now. So again, these are the CPA firms, these are insurance companies, these are all these businesses that have been around for a long time. And so for these young people coming out of college and graduate school that are forming these private equity companies, that's why you see them buying businesses that aren't kind of the most attractive that you would normally see. They're not going after the big oil and gas companies or the biggest transportation firms. We want to go local CPAs and we want to find people that we can acquire. And then once they do that, I think building that office out in India is going to create an unbelievable model that I see happening for the next 25 to 50 years with no slowing down.
I agree, and it's all music to my ears. So, thank you so much, Jake, for being on the podcast. We sincerely appreciate your time, your insights. For my audience, any CPA firm owners or any small business owners who are not sure about their insurance needs, who are looking to do something new but are unsure about the risk, who haven't looked at their insurance coverage or their risk appetite in years, Jake is the person you need to reach out to. So please go ahead and do that. Thank you again, Jake. Thank you so much.